Okay, so in this video, we're going to take a look at a couple more examples of solving quadratic inequality. So if you haven't checked out the first video where I kind of go through a little bit of the explanation, go ahead and take a look at that video. I'll go ahead and link it up at the top of the screen. Okay, this is just a few more examples to make sure that we're really good and solid with this. Okay, so remember when we're solving quadratic inequalities, we're going to want to solve by factoring, and just like when we're solving by factoring with equations, we want everything on one side and 0 on the other side. We want that standard form, and in this case we already have that standard form. Okay, now if I take a look here, I have 2x squared plus 13x minus 7 is less than 0. What this less than 0 is telling me is that we want our numbers to be negative, right? Only negative numbers are less than 0, so we want negative. We want our final answer to be negative, okay? So when we set up our number line and we test points in each interval, we want the negative interval or intervals, okay? Because we want to be less than 0. Okay, so what we have to do here is we first have to figure out what those values that are going to split the intervals up are. And remember, that's the zeros of the function. So we have to go ahead and solve this by factoring. So I'll go ahead and show the step for this. Remember, when we're factoring a quadratic trinomial, we're multiplying to AC, which in this case is negative 14, and adding to B, which in this case is 13. And what those two numbers are negative 1 and 14, because negative 1 times 14 gets us negative 14, negative 1 plus 14 gets us 13. Okay, so these are our numbers, so we go ahead and we bring down the first term, bring down the last term, and we split the middle term using our two numbers, and now we go ahead and factor. So we're going to go ahead and group our first two terms, group our last two terms, and take out a greatest common factor. Between 2x squared and negative x, all I can factor out is an x. So I factor out an x to get x times a quantity of 2x minus 1. And between 14x and negative 7, I can factor out a positive 7. And when I factor out a positive 7, I get 2x minus 1. And that's exactly what we need to happen. We have a common factor of 2x minus 1, so I can factor that out. And our other one is made up of the x plus 7. Okay, remember we bring down x positive 7. And these are our factors, okay? Now that we have this, we can go ahead and set up our number line. And remember to find out where it splits, we set each of these equal to 0 as though we were solving the equation, and we solve for x, and x would be 1/2 and x would be negative 7. So those are the numbers we put on our number line, and since this is not or equal to, we're going to hold those with open circles. Let me make those a little bit nicer. Open circles. Not much nicer, but whatever. Okay, now we have to go ahead and set up our sign table. Now we set up our sign table. Okay, so I list my factors. And remember, we're multiplying these, so we're having a product. And now we have to test out numbers in each interval. Okay, and remember, all we're looking for is if we plug in a number, does it make that factor positive or negative? Because if it's negative, that's what we want. If it's positive, that's not going to be part of our answer. So number less than negative 7, I can plug in something like negative 10. If I plug in negative 10, this would become negative 20 minus 1, which is definitely negative. If I plug in negative 10 here, I'm going to have negative 10 plus 7. That will also be negative. And when I multiply two negatives together, that gets me a positive. So this entire interval here will be positive. And since we want to be negative, that's not going to be part of our solution. Okay, now we got to test a number in between negative 7 and positive 1/2. If you can test 0, 0 is probably the easiest one to do. And if I plug in 0, I'd have 2 times 0 minus 1. That's going to be negative. In this one, I'd have 0 plus 7. That would be positive. And a negative times a positive is a negative. So this interval here is negative, okay? And that's going to be part of our answer because we want to be less than 0, and negative numbers are less than 0. So this is going to be part of our answer. And then finally, we test any number that's greater than 1/2. Positive 10 would do. If I plug in 10, I would have 20 minus 1. That's positive. 10 plus 7, that's positive. Two positives multiplied together get me a positive, okay? So this would be our number line, and as we can see, we want to be less than 0, which means we want to be negative. So our solutions would only be in this region here, okay? So we can write that as an inequality. -7 is less than x, which is less than 1/2. We don't have any or equal to's because it was not or equal to. So that would be our inequality. Or in interval notation, we'd have -7 with parenthesis around it because it's not or equal to, up to positive 1/2 with a parenthesis around it because it's not or equal to. Okay, so we have our solution graphed, our solution as an inequality, and our solution as an interval. Okay, and we wanted the negative because we wanted to be less than 0. All right, good. So let's go ahead and try another example. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one. So 6x squared plus x minus 15 is greater than or equal to 4x squared. All right, go ahead and pause the video and try this one out, and I'll walk us through this. Okay, so remember, whenever we're solving by factoring, we need everything on one side. We need it on in standard form. So I need to move that 4x squared over. So I'm going to subtract 4x squared to each side, and I'm going to get 6x squared. Oh, excuse me, we're subtracting. So 6x squared minus 4x squared would actually get us 2x squared plus x minus 15 is greater than or equal to 0. And now, since this is now in standard form, I'm looking here, I want to be greater than or equal to 0. So what this here is telling me is if we want to be greater than or equal to 0, we want positive numbers, okay? So any interval that gets us positive is going to be part of our solution, okay? And for this one, we would go ahead and factor, and we'd be multiplying to a times c, which in this case is -30, adding the b, which is 1, and that's going to be 6 and -5. So remember, once again, bring down your first term, bring down your last term, and split your middle term using these two numbers, 6 and -5. Attach a variable. And now we factor by grouping. So in this first group here, between 2x squared and 6x, I can factor out a 2x. I can factor out a 2x. And when I factor out a 2x, I'm going to have x plus 3. And between -5x and -15, I can factor out a -5. -5 factored out, that's going to become 1x plus 3. And notice I have that 1x plus 3 happening twice, so I can factor that out, and my other factor is made up of the 2x minus 5, okay? 2x minus 5. And now we can go ahead and set up our number line and our sign table. And in this case, I would have x plus 3 is equal to 0, so I have -3 as a 0, and now I'd have 2x minus 5 is equal to 0, which is going to get me 5/2. So -3, positive 5/2, and since it's or equal to, these are going to be closed. Okay, and we go ahead and we split this up. So I have my factors over here of x plus 3, 2x minus 5, and these are multiplying. So once again, they're getting us a product, okay? And just like in the last time, we're going to go ahead and pick test points and test it out, except in this time, since we want to be greater than or equal to 0, we want the positive answers. Okay, so let's say I plug in any number less than -3, so in this interval, so I can plug in like -10. If I plug in a -10, I'd have a -10 plus 3, that's going to be negative. I'd have a -20 minus 5, that's going to be negative. Two negatives multiplied together get us a positive, so this interval will be positive, okay? And that's going to be part of our answer because we want it to be positive. But now I got to test out the other two intervals, so I can pick a number in between -3 and positive 5/2, something like 0. If I plug in 0, 0 plus 3 is positive. If I plug in 0 here, that would be 2 times 0, 0 minus 5, that would be negative. Positive times a negative is a negative, so this interval here would be negative. Now I can test any number greater than 5/2. I can plug in like 10. Well, 10 plus 3 would be positive. 20 minus 5 would be positive. Positive times a positive is a positive. So our interval here would be positive. And since we want to be greater than or equal to 0, we want the positive intervals, and there's two of them. We got this one going this way, and this one going this way. Okay, and in inequality form, we'd have x. As we can see, x is less than or equal to negative 3. Or x is greater than or equal to 5/2, or we can have the interval notation. Well, it's going from negative infinity up to negative 3 with negative 3 included with a bracket, or starting at 5/2, including 5/2 because it's or equal to with a bracket, going to infinity. Okay, so that is solving inequalities. Once again, make sure that we're practicing these skills. This is going to be extremely useful, especially because eventually we're going to be covering polynomial inequalities as well as rational inequalities, and it's really not all that different from this. Okay, all the practices that we do here are going to be furthered in polynomial and rational inequalities. So make sure that we're practicing these skills, and as we move forward, we're going to start covering complex numbers. We're going to start talking about how we can solve using the quadratic formula, completing the square, and how we do those. So make sure you're practicing this and stay tuned for future videos.